house in an isolated location, a demonic entity possessing a young boy, and even more macabre hidden secrets are what I will tell you about today. The ending is the worst part of this story. I am Lucas, an apprentice exorcist, and this is the story that marked my descent into hell, alongside Henrique, my mentor. Henrique, in his early 50s, had eyes that seemed to pierce the souls of people. His deep wrinkles and grave voice were marks of countless battles against evil. He was an imposing figure, shaped by years of spiritual confrontations. I was new to this world, freshly out of seminary, still full of doubts and fears. My past was somewhat dark, a secret I kept closely guarded, but it pushed me towards this journey. Henrique saw something in me, perhaps a shadow of what he had once been. We were called to a case of possession in a 12-year-old boy named Diego. Father Jose, the leader of the local parish, sent us a desperate plea. Diego's family was terrified by the boy's increasingly violent and disturbing behavior. As we prepared to leave, I felt a coldness that seemed to freeze my soul. Henrique, noticing my unease, simply said, "Fear is a constant companion, Lucas. Learn to act with it by your side." The journey to Diego's house felt like a descent into the deepest pits of hell. The car shook along the winding and bumpy roads as the landscape around us became increasingly desolate. The sky, covered by dark clouds, seemed to announce the arrival of something bad. Henrique drove in silence, his gaze fixed on the road, but I could feel the tension in his muscles. The journey to Diego's house felt like a descent into the deepest pits of hell. The car shook along the winding and bumpy roads as the landscape around us became increasingly desolate. The sky, covered by dark clouds, seemed to announce the arrival of something evil. Henrique drove in silence, his gaze fixed on the road, but I could feel the tension in his muscles. As we approached, a sense of oppression began to intensify. It was as if the very air was charged with an unspeakable evil. Diego's house emerged on the horizon, an old and decrepit structure, almost hidden by dense and neglected vegetation. The shadows of the tall, twisted trees seemed to stretch out like skeletal fingers, trying to reach us. As soon as we parked, the silence was broken only by the sound of our footsteps on the gravel. The house, with its dark windows and creaky doors, exuded an aura of doom. Every fiber of my being screamed to flee from there, but Henrique's firm presence by my side forced me to move forward. We were greeted by Father Jose, a man whose appearance reflected nights of insomnia and constant terror. With a trembling voice, he began to describe the disturbing events plaguing the house. Diego was a normal boy until he started to change. He speaks in languages we've never heard, shows superhuman strength, and his eyes are empty, as if something had stolen his soul. Looking around, I noticed crucifixes hanging in every corner of the room, candles burning with flickering flames, and images of saints with anguished expressions. Everything seemed a desperate attempt to keep something dark at bay. Henrique listened attentively without interrupting, but I could see the concern on his hardened face. "It all started with noises during the night," continued Father Jose. "Furniture moving on its own, doors slamming, whispers that seemed to come from the walls. We thought it was just a phase, something Diego would outgrow. But then he started hurting himself. And others." His voice faltered for a moment, and he had to take a deep breath to continue. "Last night, he attacked his parents. They are severely injured in the hospital." The description was suffocating. Something twisted in my stomach. I looked to Henrique for some guidance, but he was focused, calculating every detail. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Lucas, we need to prepare. This will be harder than we imagined." The tension between us was palpable. Henrique and I decided to split up to investigate and cover more ground. Henrique chose to explore the house, while I stayed to monitor Diego, watching each of his strange movements. Henrique moved with calmness, his flashlight illuminating the dark corners and stained walls with a sinister history. I watched him for a moment before turning my attention back to Diego, who was sitting in a chair, chained, his eyes glazed over and fixed on me. As Henrique explored the house, I found myself staring at Diego. His body, though small and frail, emanated a sense of imminent danger. He was quiet, but his eyes followed me, filled with a hatred that did not seem to belong to a 12-year-old boy. I began to murmur low prayers, trying to keep my mind focused and ward off the growing sense of dread. On the other side of the house, Henrique found the first macabre clues that he later came to tell me about. He reported finding a locked room that caught his attention. Forcing the door open, he entered a space that seemed to have been a personal sanctuary. On the walls, demonic symbols were engraved. On the floor, circles of melted candles indicated ancient and dangerous rituals. In the center of the room, an old doll lay, its glass eyes reflecting the light of Henrique's flashlight. I, on the other hand, tried to understand Diego. In a moment of distraction, his eyes met mine, and a twisted smile formed on his face. He began to murmur in an unknown language, his voice low and guttural, different from anything I had ever heard. I felt a chill down my spine and instinctively stepped back. Diego's words were incomprehensible, but they made me extremely uncomfortable. Henrique continued his exploration, discovering more signs that something deeply evil had taken root in that house. When he opened a drawer in an old dresser, he found family photos, all marked with blood symbols. The macabre sight made his heart race, and a sense of urgency overtook him. Henrique continued his investigation throughout the house until he decided to explore the basement. Each step he took down the creaking wooden staircase felt like a deeper plunge into the abyss of horror. The air in the basement was heavy, laden with the metallic odor of dried blood and decomposition. At the bottom, he noticed something in the darkest corner of the basement. There was a door partially concealed by old barrels and boxes. With effort, he pushed it open, revealing a small, claustrophobic space. What he found inside made his blood run cold. Mutilated bodies, unrecognizable and in an advanced state of decomposition, were scattered across the floor. The human forms were distorted, deep-cut marks covering the flesh, and the faces, or what remained of them, were frozen in expressions of eternal agony. The walls of the small space were stained with blood, and there was an improvised altar, covered with melted candles and broken bones, that seemed to be the center of profane rituals. Henrique felt his stomach turn, the experienced exorcist almost succumbing to the horror of the scene. With heavy breathing, he began to murmur prayers of protection, trying to fend off the darkness that surrounded him. He knelt beside the bodies, searching for any signs of identity, any clues about who these victims were. His eyes filled with tears, not only for the tragedy he was witnessing, but also for the feeling of helplessness in the face of such deep-seated evil. When he returned to the surface, Henrique was pale and shaken. His steps were heavier, his posture, which always carried an aura of authority, now reflected the darkness he had encountered. Diego, now more agitated than ever, laughed maniacally, as if the entity inside him knew exactly what Henrique had seen. Henrique was visibly shaken when he returned from the basement. His words were urgent as he addressed Father Jose. "Father, you need to seek more help immediately. Call the police and report what we found down there. Bodies and demonic rituals. Something much more sinister is happening here." When he returned to the surface, Henrique was pale and shaken. His steps were heavier, his posture, which always carried an aura of authority, now reflected the darkness he had encountered. Diego, now more agitated than ever, laughed maniacally, as if the entity inside him knew exactly what Henrique had seen. Henrique was visibly shaken when he returned from the basement. His words were urgent as he addressed Father Jose. "Father, you need to seek more help immediately. Call the police and report what we found down there. Bodies and demonic rituals. Something much more sinister is happening here." Father Jose, pale and with trembling hands, nodded quickly. "I'll do that right now." He ran to the phone, leaving us alone with Diego, who was laughing maniacally. Henrique turned to me. "We need to start the exorcism now. This entity seems very evil and powerful." I prepared the sacred items we had brought: crucifixes, holy water, candles, and the ritual book. Henrique began the ritual with a solemn prayer, his voice echoing through the room. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I conjure you, evil spirit, to reveal your name and leave this child in peace." Diego writhed violently, his screams filling the room. The chains binding him began to vibrate, almost breaking under the entity's force. Henrique continued, now sprinkling holy water over the boy. "By the power of Christ, I expel you!" The entity reacted with inhuman fury, making Diego rise partially, even while bound. His eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. The temperature in the room dropped drastically, and a primal sense of fear settled in. The lights flickered, threatening to go out completely. Henrique did not waver, maintaining his focus and continuing to recite the sacred words. Then the entity began to speak through Diego, its voice a cacophony of distorted echoes. "You have no power over me. I know your secrets, Henrique. You are not as holy as you seem." Henrique hesitated for a brief moment, but continued the ritual. "Silence, impure spirit. By the blood of Christ, I command you to leave this body." The entity laughed, a sound that resonated like breaking glass. "Tell him, Henrique. Tell Lucas what you did, what the church has hidden all these years." My heart raced, a sense of dread growing within me. "What is he talking about, Henrique?" Henrique swallowed hard, his face a mask of internal conflict. "Lucas, this is not the time for that. Focus on the exorcism." But the entity did not stop. "Henrique killed a girl years ago in an exorcism gone wrong, and the church covered it up, hiding his failure. An innocent died because of his incompetence." I looked at Henrique, seeking some confirmation, but his expression said it all. He had a dark past, a mistake he carried like a scar on his soul. Henrique, with a visible expression of pain and regret, responded, "Yes, Lucas, it's true, but that doesn't change what we need to do now. We need to save Diego." For a brief moment, I almost let it shake me, but I snapped back to reality like a click in the brain. The entity was gaining strength, and Diego was in danger. I gathered all the courage I had left, and yes, I was afraid, and joined Henrique in the ritual. "By the power of Christ, we expel you, evil spirit." The entity let out a piercing scream, and Diego began to convulse. Henrique and I focused, sacred words flowing from us like a torrent, confronting the darkness. "Leave this body, impure spirit," Henrique shouted, raising the crucifix. The entity retaliated, launching an invisible force that threw us against the walls. I hit the wall with more force, lost my breath, and struggled momentarily to speak or breathe, but I fought to get up. The mission was more important. The room seemed to be on fire, a conflict of energies clashing violently. Henrique, already standing with a silver crucifix, approached Diego, placed the crucifix on his forehead, and said in a grave and authoritative tone, "By the power of faith, and in the name of Jesus, I cast you into the abyss of the lake of fire. Leave this body and never return." Diego let out a scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. The entity fought back, but gradually, the evil force began to diminish. Finally, with a final roar of defeat, the demonic presence was expelled, leaving Diego exhausted and in tears. The silence after the exorcism was overwhelming. Diego, now free of the evil entity, lay on the floor, exhausted and in tears. His expressions, which had been filled with inhuman hatred, now showed only deep emptiness. The psychological impact of what he had gone through was clear on his pale face and in his eyes, which seemed to have lost the light of childhood. He trembled uncontrollably, muttering incoherencies as silent tears streamed down his face. I was beside Diego, shaken and in shock. The revelation about Henrique, something he had never mentioned, the confrontation with the entity, and the horror of what had been discovered in the basement, all weighed on me like a mountain. I felt exhausted, both mentally and physically. My body ached from the impact and the tension. Henrique, also visibly shaken, slowly stood up. His face was marked by pain and fatigue. He approached me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Lucas, we did good work here. Diego is safe, at least for now." The emotional state of both of us was one of complete exhaustion. Henrique, despite his experience, seemed like this event had drained his soul. I, still young and inexperienced, was trying to process everything that had happened. There was a heavy silence between us, interrupted only by Diego's weak murmurs. It didn't take long for the church reinforcements to arrive. Priests and brothers came running, carrying more sacred items and prepared to help, but the ritual was already over. The leader of the reinforcements, an older man with an air of authority, looked around, assessing the scene. "We arrived late," he said, his voice heavy with regret, and called Henrique to report what had happened. Shortly after, the police arrived, alerted by Father Jose. They began to investigate the house and soon discovered the horrors in the basement. The sight of the bodies was macabre and horrifying, spreading a climate of fear among the officers. An investigation was quickly set up, and the house was sealed off as a crime scene. While the officers and church reinforcements worked, an even darker truth emerged. Diego's parents, once considered innocent victims, were revealed to be members of a satanic cult. Documents found in the house showed they had been involved in dark rituals for years. Diego was intended to be the vessel for a powerful demon known as Paimon, and the people killed in the basement were sacrifices made to facilitate the possession. Diego's parents were arrested, and the entire town was in shock with the revelations. Diego, now without his parents, was placed under the custody of an uncle who lived in another city. The boy, traumatized and broken, was taken away with little information about his future. The church and authorities decided to keep the details secret, trying to protect the young boy from further suffering and public curiosity. What happened to Diego after that day remained a mystery, but we knew he would carry the scars of what happened forever. We left that house with heavy hearts, and I, with a new understanding of what it meant to fight against evil. The darkness we had faced would not be the last, and I was determined to be prepared for what came next. The world was a darker place than I had ever imagined, but I was ready to face the horrors that awaited us.